Welcome. My name is Dr. Paul Mitchell. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin in Agricultural and Applied Economics, and today I'm going to give my presentation from the 5th International Research Conference on HLB. My talk is titled Black Swans, Dragons, and the Phoenix, Rebuilding Citrus After HLB, and it was the opening keynote address. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin, focused primarily on commodity crops, corn and soybeans. Among my other titles, I'm director of the Rank Agribusiness Institute, also co-director of the UW Extension's Nutrient Pest Management Program, and I'm also a state specialist in UW Extension. And today, I'm somewhat uncomfortable talking to a bunch of citrus scientists about my own, when I think of myself as corn and soybean. I work a lot in ag biotech. So when I'm talking about citrus, if it sounds like I don't know what I'm talking about, it's because I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm doing my best. What I'm going to do today is talk about three major parts. What do mythological symbols like black swans, dragons, and the phoenix have to do with HLB? That's the title, and I'll give you a sense of what I mean by all that. The second part is some of my own economic research and provide an economic perspective on HLB, really focusing on just how bad is it. And then finally, I want to give some of my reflections on the role of research for rebuilding citrus after HLB. And most of that's built on the lessons I've developed from my own research and my own experiences in pest economics and agricultural biotechnology here in the Midwest. Black swan is an old phrase meaning something impossible. Probably the nearest equivalent now would be something like we might say when hell freezes over. The first attestment in Western civilization is the Roman poet Juvenal in the late 1st century. He's talking about the perfect wife in his satire, so take it with a grain of salt. But a perfect wife, rara vis in terris nigroque simil ma caigno. She's a rare bird in the lands, something like a black swan. This was the usage for centuries. And then in the 1590s, some Dutch explorers found real black swans in Western Australia, and so the whole usage had to change. Instead of being something that was impossible, it had to be something that was thought impossible that was later proven possible. And so in general, the term black swan wasn't particularly prominent in Western culture until recently in Nassim Taleb's new book in 2007 at that time, The Black Swan. He's a specialist in financial risk management, and so this book came out just before the Great Recession. To be a black swan event is a surprise, at least to the observer. It has to have a major effect, and then after the event, it is rationalized by hindsight as something that people thought was fairly obvious. Some examples they give is things like the breaking out of World War I, the fall of the Soviet Union, how much the personal computer has changed our culture, the internet, or even the September 11th attacks in 2001. They can't be predicted with using standard methods or standard statistical models, and that's his point as a person working in financial management. Your models have to be robust to these kind of events. And his real point of the book is to push that we need a more black swan robust society, which I think we might think of as resilient today. And these effects of these black swan events are tremendous. The path you are following as a culture, as a society, permanently shifts. You cannot go back. You have embarked on a new trajectory, new attitudes, new ways of thinking, new institutions. It's a paradigm shift, a revolution. Pick your favorite buzzword. I'm reminded of at the beginning of the Lord of the Rings and the movies and from the book, J.R. Tolkien's phrase, the world has changed. I see it in the water, I feel it in the earth, I smell it in the air. In our own recent history, I think the best example is the Great Recession. These are data from, this is the U.S. Real gross domestic product per capita. So how much productivity each person in the U.S. has created starting from post-World War II until the current period. These are all in real dollars corrected, and these are not what people are paid, it's what the production is, productivity. What you can see, it's a long general trend rising upward, and then you can see the different times there's ups and down waves from different recessions, and then at the end there, just before 2010, you see the big gray bar, that's the Great Recession. We seem to be on a new trajectory. You can see a nice exponential growth curve, nice and smooth, with some waves on and off of it, but then all of a sudden, here comes the Great Recession, and we are seen to be on a brand new trajectory. HLB, Huanglongbing, is a black swan. This is Florida citrus production USDA NASS data since 1990 until 2015. I just found the new data for 2016 here last night, and so I put it on the slide just before the presentation. You can see its citrus was fairly standard, fairly steady for several years. Then all of a sudden it begins to drop here at the rise of HLB in about 2004, 2005. We seem to be on a new trajectory. You can just see the tremendous drop that occurs, and then here comes a new trajectory. In terms of numbers, 2004 to 2015 saw a 61% decrease in the Florida citrus production. You take the forecast of 2016, it's a 68% reduction since 2004. This is a new trajectory. This is a black swan event. This graph is the same citrus production, and the green line now is bearing acres. You can see even for years, since 1997, citrus bearing acres are in a decline, and then HLB arose. Florida citrus production still held steady in those years as citrus bearing acres are declining, production held steady until HLB. Here's our yield per acre in boxes on the axis there. You can see the numbers, but fairly steady, up and down with weather and events, hurricanes and such, and freezes. And then HLB comes along and it drops off. You can see it's a new numbers. The average from 1989 to 2004 was 363 boxes per acre. 2005 to 2015, all of a sudden it's 309 boxes per acre. So what happens when a black swan lands? What do people do when one of these events occurs? There's a whole psychology of crisis management. You can go read about this stuff, and this is important for dealing with crises. Well, the short answer is people do stupid things. The initial rush is panic, fear, anger, denial, and disbelief. How do people respond in these crises? Initially, it's panic. The sky is falling. If it's a fake crisis, Chicken Little, or it can be a real crisis, obviously. Often there's a blame game. Who moved my cheese? That was a famous book in the late 90s about the mouse running around the maze, used to how things worked, and all of a sudden the cheese wasn't there. People start blaming each other as one of the responses. Who took my cheese? Denial is another common one. There's really no problem. Stick your head in the sand like the proverbial ostrich. These are all common responses initially. Longer term, people start to realize this isn't going away. It tends to realize you got to think longer term, and it becomes you start to realize this is going to stay around. People start having false hopes. They start grasping at straws, or I think more realistically, you see snake oil salespeople show up, ready to sell you the latest and greatest, some sort of cure-all for the problem. But longer term, also a depression tends to set in. There can be an active or a passive depression. The passive one is sort of becoming dazed and confused, listless, withdrawn, wander. You see stories or read them or watch them. People become withdrawn. I'm thinking of the soldier who's overworked or post-traumatic stress syndrome from other events. People withdraw, and you see images of that. But there's also an active type of depression that sets in, and I think of sort of the English saying, keep calm and carry on. Kind of go through the motions of life and not get too worked up, but the heart is gone. You're not as excited anymore, not as passionate. Classical myth, there's a story, Sisyphus rolling the rock up the hill every day, rolls it up the hill, struggles all day long, gets up to the top of the hill, it rolls down, and the next day it's back to the same old job. The light has gone out of your eyes. You can quit, abandon ship, lose all hope. You can get into an energetic setting of fighting, circle the wagons, and go into defense. But these are all kinds of responses, and none of them really create the solution. So kind of go back to here. Now we talked about black swans. What about dragons? Dragon historically has been a symbol of power, grandeur, a primal force of nature. You look at the political iconography, and political powers often associate themselves with dragons. In the Eastern tradition, a dragon is often seen as lucky or wise or benevolent. Think of the Disney movie Mushu in Mulan. He was sort of like the Jiminy Cricket character for Mulan. Or you can go into the Western civilization. It's often a being of malice and trickery. Again, Lord of the Rings, you think of Smaug and the Hobbit. More recently, Game of Thrones, the dragons are not lucky or wise, benevolent creatures. HLB is both types of these dragons. The disease is named yellow dragon disease, or probably more proper in the actual Chinese is yellow shoot disease, but they mean very similar things. And you've all heard the saying, Chinese word for crisis is danger and opportunity. They're the same thing. It's technically not true. Go read the Wikipedia article on it, but people want it to be true, and we say it over and over, and many famous people have said it, but it's actually not true, but we want it to be true. And I think that's where we are today. The space between black swans and dragons is where opportunity exists, between this primal force of nature and this random rare event. HLB crisis is ongoing, but we are in the middle of building a new path. And not everyone's going to, or everywhere is going to survive. We've got hard work, science, innovation, and luck are going to be needed to rebuild citrus after HLB. And I'm sure many of you know the phoenix is the symbol of rebirth, with one generation born from the ashes of the previous. Citrus is going to see new leaders emerge, new institutions, new ways of doing things. It's just going to have to. Will it see a return to the glory days? I don't know. Will it see a collapse? Look at those numbers for Florida, and you kind of wonder, will it just be a smaller, leaner citrus, different, but still there? I think, sure, old citrus regions could disappear and new ones arise. We'll see. It's very much this period of opportunity between the crisis and the primal force of nature. So now the last question here on this section is like, why all this myth and symbolism? Humans have used myths and stories and symbols and imagery to motivate ourselves and inspire ourselves for thousands of years. Humans are social and spiritual beings. We all need inspiration and motivation, even scientists. We should remind ourselves that improving the science about HLB to help rebuild citrus globally is a useful and honorable activity for our time and efforts. This is worth doing. This is an important problem, and we are up to something very useful here. And I'm reminded when I was in graduate school at Iowa State University, Stephen Jay Gould came to visit campus. He's a paleontologist, evolutionary biologist. He's a controversial figure. I remember there's a lot of tension. And the one thing that I don't remember all the details of the talk or anything, this is the only thing I remember, is he talked about how scientists need inspiration as well. He said, I kind of remember it being, he said, science is just god-awful boring. And so you have to be motivated. And so I went looking to see if you can actually find any attestment to this. And there's a Scientific American article as cited here. The quote is, "The day-to-day work of science is intensely boring." That's why we need to remind ourselves and stay inspired. We are up to something important here. The next section here is going to be on the economic research, and really it's a economic analysis of just how bad HLB is. Now, this is work that's really led by Dr. Fengxia Dong. She's at University of Wisconsin as an associate scientist. And we're sort of asking some questions. What is the economic impact of HLB in Florida? And we're trying to answer that question. In what way and how much has HLB contributed to the decline in citrus-bearing acres? And really, we're going to focus in on analyzing newly planted citrus acres and the removal of citrus acres in aggregate, not at the individual level, but at the aggregate USDA NASS level. And really, what we're after that, 2 areas on acreage and then on how HLB has affected citrus yields. So these are the data. I've showed this graph before. The colors were different, but this is citrus-bearing acres in Florida, and it's been in decline since 1997. You can see the little drop here in starting in 2000, from 2005 to 2006. But you can see it's been on a long, steady trend. But instead of trying to focus on that, we want to look at what brings in new acres and what drives people to take acres out of production. So what we're actually going to do is try to fit the green line, which is new acres coming in. You can see it was very high in the early 90s, and then it's dropped off and bounced around at a lower level between 10 and 20,000. And then the more variable one is the brown line, which is citrus acres removed from production. You can see it's gone all over the place with some really big peaks here in late 2006, 2007, when HLB was first really hitting hard. We're going to try to understand the economics that drive these 2 lines. So I'm just going to focus on the results here and not going through all the estimation equations and everything. And what we have here are the 5 variables that we're using to explain the green line, the new citrus planting acres. And so the first one is the bearing acres, the 5-year average. And so what this is essentially means is 0.05 means that 5% of your acres are replaced each year. And that makes sense. As the more acres you have, if you have 1 million acres or only have 500,000 acres, you're going to have a different amount of acres needed each year to replace because you've got larger acres if you have 1 million acres. And so that one's basically means about 5% of your acres are replaced each year, which roughly on a 20-year cycle in aggregate is the average. Expected long-run profit is another variable that's significant. And that basically means if the profit was good over the last 2-3 years, you tend to plant more new citrus acres in the current year, which again makes sense. If citrus is profitable, you tend to want to replant. And then HLB is the next variable that's significant, and that says that roughly 5,000 acres are taken out of production each year, or are not planted, I should say, as a result of HLB. It reduces the newly planted acres by 5,000 acres each year. The other variables weren't significant, so I'm not going to discuss them. Now, this one's looking at how many acres are taken out of production. And in this one, there's 2 variables that are significant. Expected short-run profit. If last year was a very profitable year, the number of acres taken out falls by quite a bit. 40,000 is what it says there. It depends on how profit is normalized in this result here, but the variable as normalized is somewhere around 0.8 to 1. So say 35 to 40,000 acres are taken out if the previous year was a very profitable year. The other one is the Florida Housing Price Index, and that's indexed such that it's pretty large, and so this number is a good big effect, probably in the range of 40,000 acres, can be taken out of, removed. More acres are removed when housing prices are higher, which makes a total sense. If houses become a viable option as an outside option instead of citrus, people replace their citrus grows with housing. Surprisingly, HLB was not significant, and then its sign is in the way you wouldn't expect it to reduce citrus removal. But it just shows you that economics is how it's driving these decisions on citrus removal more than HLB in a direct sense. And you got to remember, this is not at the individual field level, this is at the aggregate level, not at the individual farmer making decisions. The next one here this is citrus yield. We've seen this figure as well. Now we're going to explain this, and these are the variables we used. And there's really only two that showed up as significant. Expected short-run profit gives us a large 122, this would be boxes per acre. And as profit last year is good, people tend to spend more money on inputs, and so the yields go up. And so if last year's a good year, you're going to tend to have higher yields this coming year because you take the extra money and put on more fertilizer, do better pest management, do a better job in weed control and such. And then the HLB effect is large and negative there, 106.5. That says when HLB shows up, per acre yields, boxes per acre, fall by over 100 boxes per acre. And again, these both make sense. The other variables weren't significant. Hurricanes, there wasn't very many in the time period of the analysis. And you can see there's some effect there, but it doesn't make any sense. Increases yields, I doubt it. Trend is a big issue in the Midwest with corn, but it didn't show up as important here in the citrus. We take these results and we also estimate supply and demand equations. What we want to look at now is how does this impact of HLB on the citrus market, and then what does it do to prices? In particular, we're going to focus on what we call consumer and producer surplus, which we call social surplus measures of value or impacts of events. So the market beforehand here on the left shows the supply and demand equations in the conceptual simple model. Then afterwards, the HLB comes in. You can see it shifts the supply curve backwards or upwards, whichever way you want to think of it. And that's because there's higher costs for farmers to produce citrus, so that reduces their ability to supply citrus at any given price. And then the same thing, the yields fall, which is what we saw. The reduction in yield also makes them unable to supply citrus at any given price, or less able to. And so that's how we first model that shift in the supply curve, and then we focus on putting a dollar value to it. We call something called social surplus. This is a very standard method economists use to measure impacts. And it's really focused on these triangles here. If you make them lines, or these triangle-like shapes here. The consumer surplus, producer surplus initially, then after HLB, you get these smaller areas. That means a reduction, what we call surplus. For growers, surplus is income, it's profit. For consumers, it's money left over after buying things because you didn't have to pay as much as you were willing to pay. A simple example would be if you're willing to pay $3 for an orange, but you only had to pay $2, you have $1 of surplus. It's money left over that consumers can spend elsewhere. So the net effect would be of the HLB would be this surplus on the left, on the right, minus the surplus on the left. So a negative number, a small area minus a larger area is a negative surplus. And so we'll have a loss, which is what would make sense. So we estimated the yield loss due to HLB just from our equations I showed a few slides ago was 29.3%. That's at 106.5 divided by that long run average of citrus before HLB. Singerman and Usecha had a recent estimate here in Florida, 33% for southwestern Florida based on a grower survey. So you can see we're not too far out of line. This is our 29.3% would be over the whole time period. The cost impact of HLB is another parameter we need to use to shift that supply curve backwards. Again, this is work based off of Marrero in 2012. What's the average for 2007 to 2010 across different regions in Florida? It's a 27.5% cost increase. So you put these into the model, shift the supply curve backwards like I showed in the previous slides, and what do you get for a dollar value? It ends up being a loss to society of $466 million per year. This is a preliminary estimate. This is far from final. We'll be writing it up for a journal article, but This loss is split into $125 million in consumer losses. That's less spending consumers have. And the other big one, though, is producer losses, $340 million a year lost in producer income. To give you a sense of the scale of this $340 million, the average over the last 10 years, 2006 to 2015, is in Florida was a $1.24 billion industry. So this $340 million loss is substantial. So what are the implications of this loss? $341 million producer income loss, that's less money growers are going to have to do and to fund research and to invest in mitigation and management alternatives. If they want to build a new system, buy a bunch of new trees, they have less money to do so. There's also less money they can contribute of their own to fund research. You can estimate how large the social losses also could be for other regions. I'm thinking California or other regions, maybe the Mediterranean or something, two areas that don't have the citrus psyllid and HLB yet. The other thing to note is this $466 million loss would justify lots of spending in a cost-benefit analysis, spending for things like prevention, monitoring, eradication, delay, or containment. Preventing that annual loss ex post, you realize it would be worth spending $20 million on some of these solutions. Research for solutions and mitigation and management alternatives, these are all worthwhile spending in a simple cost-benefit analysis. If you risk losing that many $1 million, spending you can spend a lot of money and still justify that kind of that spending on different issues like this. So the last part here now is talking about rebuilding citrus after HLB. What will this new citrus industry be? A return to our glory days, or a smaller and leaner citrus, or maybe a total collapse? It's still up in the air, I believe. However, innovation and research are going to be the foundation of whatever this new citrus will be. The part I've really come to realize is there's different kinds of research that need to be done at different levels, and it's not just something that happens on university and government labs. There's different types of innovation and research are needed, and they're best done at different levels and by different agents at different funding sources and different incentives and rewards. You have your standard universities and governments. I'm thinking ARS labs or field stations. But these by far don't have the only control of research and innovation. Private industry, of course, does it. You think of the multinational corporations. But also there are smaller businesses that do a lot of this as well. Crop consultants and such, and farmers do a lot of innovation. They're the ones who take ideas that have been invented at universities or private industry and figure out how to make them profitable or more profitable on their farms. So traditional research is going to be needed. I'm thinking standard research and innovation on insect and pathogen biology, management, and agronomic responses to the problem. You can do temporary short-term management of the problem. That's what some of these are. Maybe they'll help the industry survive until something better comes along. We find a better solution. Just keep ourselves going so that when the new fix comes out, we have an industry still left. However, it might be as good as it gets. We might only have these kind of solutions. We'll have to see. It might become the new reality for citrus production. These all have research and innovation roles for everyone from the farmer, the crop consultant, all the way up to the universities and multinational corporations. And these sorts of research they're better understood, the risks involved, and the economics are. Biotechnology is the other area I want to talk about briefly. And to me, there's lots of possibilities there. Most of this is going to be done by government, university, and multinational corporations because the labs are take more work and more facilities. And the risks and the economics are less understood in that area. So talk some about some of these more traditional areas and how they're going to be a major part of our response to HLB and rebuilding the citrus industry. First is insect vector management. You can see there's been a lot of work done on insecticides and biocides for either the insect pest. I suppose you could add in the pathogen itself. There's governments and universities, of course, and multinationals are doing this. A lot of this is efficacy trials, trying different management methods, what works and what does not work. They're going to even doing the work necessary to extend the label for existing products to new crops and new pathogens or new pests. There's work on biocontrol. Often only public sector people do this. It's hard to really make a commercial return on investment for a lot of these. But even the practical application of biocontrol needs a lot of work by farmers and consultants just because it works, in theory. They have to make it actually work practically. There's a lot of work to be done in insect and pathogen biology. This is done at government agencies, universities, multinationals do a lot of this kind of work. It really helps improve the chemical and biological control methods. But there's actually a lot of local or practical knowledge from farmers and consultants. They might understand better sense of, I've noticed a lot of times the insects do this, or I see the trees looking like that. There's a lot of knowledge you can gain from them as well, just from their experience with the pathogen or the pest. Another area is area-wide management. It's likely needed to coordinate actions to reduce inoculum, to clean up abandoned acres. It requires developing and implementing new solutions or processes to facilitate cooperation. The chimas are a good example here in Florida and elsewhere. There's a lot of social innovation research needed. It's behavioral economics. You need both theoretical and practical knowledge. So this is a lot of people at the universities are doing this and government researchers, but there's also some key outreach and extension people or work that needs to be done. And there's some issues like how do you pay for these institutions and activities? How do you make a CHIMA self-funding? It's social research. It's not labs or plots, but it's a lot of talking and thinking, building, understanding how to do this and building the social fabric to make this happen. The citrus industry is not going to be the same. If these CHIMAs or other pest management areas, area-wide type processes are going to work, it's going to change the industry. The social construct that supports the industry is going to have to be different. And that takes time and energy. And it's a different kind of research, but it's just as useful. Resistance management is also going to be important. Pests and pathogens are going to become resistant control methods eventually. You can only slow or delay the inevitable. There's a lot of biological research to be done to understand resistance management. It depends on the species and the control methods used. Is it multiple methods better? Do you use multiple modes? Do you rotate them? Do you use full doses, etc.? All that stuff varies. But actually, I think what happens among scientists a lot is they forget about the social aspect, which is often just as important. Just because you've developed or understand what should be done to best manage the problem from a biological perspective does not mean farmers or the industry are going to follow those resistant management practices. This is a big problem in the upper Midwest where I'm from with herbicide-resistant weeds. And it's a common issue underlying many problems we have in what I'd call our social or just human problems in general. You see this happen over and over again. It doesn't explain all our problems, but a lot of them. There's you pay the costs now and the benefits come in the future. That's what we have with resistance management. You have to take on extra costs for practices, but the benefits don't happen until years down the line when you've prevented or delayed resistance. The other problem that happens a lot is you get the benefits now and don't pay the costs in the future. Both those two issues underlie a lot of problems in human society. And the point I really emphasize as a social scientist is social innovation and research. It's real research. It takes a lot of time and energy. It's both theoretical and practical. And it happens at all levels. There's university and government people, university scientists, social scientists working on these things. Extension people have a lot to contribute in this area. Large corporations are concerned about this and management and making things happen. But there's also a lot of work done by farmers and agricultural professionals just to make sure resistance management happens. And that's the one thing I've noted in my own career on ag biotech in the upper Midwest is how much we forget about the social aspects of resistance management. They're just as important, sometimes even more important than the biological. There's also cultural control methods out there. The one I just saw recently is in the Growing Produce and a recent issue, citrus under protective screen cups. It's a cultural control method. It's not all about insects and pathogens using insecticides or biocides. It's more than just HLB. It also controls other pests and pathogens, sunburn, wind, scarring. There's humidity benefits, food safety. You no longer have birds, pooping on your trees and getting in the food supply potentially. It's used globally for lots of different crops, and it's a highly managed system. You can manage your pests, your water, your nutrients. And I see this as a trend. I'm seeing a lot of the specialty crops also, but even in our corn and soybeans. It's a trend toward what I call data-driven adaptive management. Lots of information is collected, and I think you can think about tree-specific monitoring and management on a tree-by-tree basis. There's a lot of work to be done in this. There's a lot of economics. What's the cost? What's the productivity gain? How effective is it? What's the return on investment? What's the life expectancy? What about hurricanes and winds or other types of factors? Sun damage to the plastic or whatever the screen is. There's a lot of work to be done for research at the universities to try this out, but I think the real innovation will come at the farm level. You can do a small university trial or a government agency on an ARS station or something, but farmers are to be the ones that make this work. And so if this is one possibility. I'm not saying it'll be the one that'll be successful. There's lots of options out there. Another common one is something like the heat treatment of trees. We'll see some of those presentations here at the conference. The last one I want to talk about is biotechnology. Really, there's a lot going on here, and I've seen a lot happen in the upper Midwest. We've had transgenic crops come out, our Roundup Ready crops, and the corn and soybeans, cotton, and also our BT crops, particularly in corn, but in cotton, not in Wisconsin, obviously, but down south. But they move genes between or within species. There's other things, RNAi, species-specific active ingredients. I know they've been testing foliar sprays for different insect controls. There's issues with stability. It seems to degrade with ultraviolet radiation, so obviously that's an issue. In the upper Midwest, we see PIPs, plant incorporated protection. In corn, obviously for corn rootworm, they're expecting to commercialize a RNAi corn rootworm soon, in the next year or two. The other big one, of course, has been really hot is gene editing, all the different possibilities with CRISPR, TALENs, or the zinc finger methods. There's other ones I'm sure they'll be developed, or other ones out there. Even more recently, gene drives. You can see you can introgress desirable genes into the population. This was the topic of the recent National Academy of Science report. CRISPR was called the invention of the year in 2015. So these are all, there's a lot happening. It's happening very quickly. Far from an expert on many of these, but I can give you some sense of what I've learned from the corn and soybean world. I see some potential HLB applications. I'm sure many of you are even working on these and are further ahead in all this. You can think of trees that are immune or resistant or tolerant to HLB. We got transgenic trees I know out there already. Spinach defensin proteins are out there. Rootstocks could be potentially can convey the immunity or response or resistance or tolerance, where it starts in the root, but it provides protection or tolerance in the whole tree through the scion. You can think of all the RNAi possibilities of a spray, or maybe as a plant incorporated protectant in a tree to help control the vector or the pathogen itself. We can think of edited insects, the new Psyllid project and Special Crop Research Initiative, trying to develop a new insect that no longer transmits the HLB pathogen. And then you can add in a gene drive and make them the dominant population type. We could also potentially use gene-edited insects, put it with a gene drive, and actually eradicate the insect vectors. The citrusillid here in the U.S. I'm sure there's many more ideas and inventions that'll come or will potentially be needed. I'm not going to talk so much about them. Most of you are far more better experts on that. What I want to do instead is look at lessons to learn from other biotech crops. I thought this was pretty funny. I've been in the upper Midwest working on biotech crops for years. And recently, it's pretty obvious the rollout of Roundup Ready and the BT crops did not go well. In January 2017, the Western producer, the current Monsanto CEO, failure to explain or educate public about GM was a mistake. Oh, really? He wasn't the CEO then, but we've come to a realization we could have done a better job of rolling out biotech crops back, 20 plus years ago. I think really we're seeing some changes though. Recent food crops are the Arctic apple, the Fuji, Granny Smith, and Golden Delicious. They are some biotech apples out there, genetically engineered ones. And Simplot's innate potato, the white russet. You can see some examples here. Primarily they have the gene right now. They don't turn brown. You can see these potatoes. The ones are white. These have been out for a while, and these are the non-transgenic, turn dark. You can see this slight changing coloration with the Arctic apples. I want to focus on potato because it's the one crop I know more about. And what can we learn from the white russet? Notice the first thing is the name is carefully chosen, innate. This isn't biotech, this is innate. It's just innately part of the potato. And it's the white russet. Well, aren't potatoes supposed to be white when you cut them? It's cisgenic. It's just using potato genes. It's not doing anything from a different species. There's no antibiotic or herbicide markers to make sure the traits are moved and anything. And the initial traits have all been consumer focused. Generation 1 was bruise resistant or anti-browning, like the previous slide showed. There's also low acrylamide in there, which is acrylamide, for those who don't know, it's a carcinogen. When you cook sugars to a certain temperatures, they create acrylamide, which is a carcinogen. There was talk of California putting warning labels on potato chips and French fries and such like that because of the higher acrylamide. For some reason, potatoes are just more sensitive to this than other crops, but it happens to a lot of things like even bread, baking, and such like that. It was sold in 2015, about 2,000 acres. In 2016, there's about 5,000 acres. I don't know, I haven't seen anything about what 2017 will hold. Generation 2 now is just approved for sale. And it's got late blight resistance, which is obviously more interest to the growers. That's the Irish potato famine disease. It also has reduced sugar end defect. Potatoes have issues with the sugar concentrations vary through the tuber, and you start out making really nice French fries at one end, and by the other end they turn black because there's too much sugar in them, or more than the cooking process is ready for. These are more what I think of as producer traits, if you will. There's careful supply control. They actually have very specific contracts. Not just anyone can buy this the white russet. They carefully control the supply, and it's got to have a strong, clear segregation plan, and so we don't have the Starlink corn problem where it showed up in tortilla shells and it wasn't supposed to be there. They don't want anything like that to happen. And the other thing is they tend to focus on institutional pre-processed uses, diced potatoes, institutional being like in hospitals or restaurants, schools, things like that, where they're dicing up potatoes maybe an hour or two before you need to cook them. Well, that's when you can get it done, and then they don't turn brown. They're currently not accepted, however, by McDonald's and Frito-Lay, where you think these might be useful applications of this technology. And the next thing I learned, you see in the thinking about the white russet's rollout, is they really built industry and stakeholder and consumer awareness early. They didn't show up with the product and say, "Here's what we got." They let everyone know it was coming years in advance. And these are hot topics. There was a workshop here back in September, about 6 months ago, Specialty Crop Regulatory Assistance Program. It's a workshop held, and I don't know much about the organization. I'm not, saying it's a great or bad organization. I just found this information on the internet, and they did 2 case studies for specialty crops here. Citrus tree defense and protein, which I just talked about briefly, is the one in progress, and then Simplot's WA potato, which it's one of their innate potatoes. You can see the details here. Go look it all up. But I'm going to look at these. Both of these have a overview and introduction by the developers, and I want to go through those slides briefly and look at what does citrus look like relative to potato. What do we see both of them that have is the first one is they both agreed on is meeting these regulatory hurdles takes a long time, years. And this is something I think some people don't realize. Just because you invent it in the lab and they have the eureka moment, it takes a long time, years before it actually is commercially available. I'm much more aware of the corn soybean world, but a new active ingredient, say an insecticide or a new biotech event, it takes $250 to $280 million as an older estimate, and somewhere between 10 to 15 years before it's at the market generating cash. 20 to 30 million of this is regulatory costs, according to this paper, McElroy, back in 2003 in Nature. I just became aware of a recent publication in April of 2016 from the CropLife America. A new active ingredient is $286 million. The average time before it's at the market is 11.3 years. So these are tremendous investments, spending $250 million or more and waiting 10, very much more years before you start generating any cash from that active ingredient or that new biotech event. The next thing they both agreed on is that the regulators are there to help you. You have to follow their process. They're just trying to do their jobs and go in there with a positive, you're following the bureaucratic process, and you can't go in with a chip on your shoulder and become a combative relationship with the regulators. They're just trying to do their jobs. The lessons I saw in the potato presentations and from my other knowledge of the potato industry that I didn't see in the citrus one is a couple things. One is informing the industry stakeholders of your commercial intentions and timelines early. Let them know what you're doing and that it'll be coming so they can start thinking about how they are going to respond and what they're going to do with it. How it'll fit into their overall process. Because if you can't just roll out and show up with a bunch of biotech genetically engineered oranges and expect them to put them in the orange juice industry right away. You've got to help them prepare as well. The other thing they talked about is think about trait stewardship and trait durability for a commercial business. Before you start releasing it, start thinking about how you're going to make sure it lasts, how to extend the trait. This is very much in my mind in the upper Midwest. We saw rootworm, BT corn, start to have field failures after 3 to 4 years in the field. You spend your $250, $300 million in 10, 15 years, and then after 3 to 4 years, it's already failing in the field. That's not a good investment. You don't want that to happen with your HLB resistant trees. And they really recommend thinking about how you're going to determine when you see a field failure. Is it caused by the trait no longer working right? Is there some sort of a problem with the genetic expression maybe? Is it resistance by the pest, or is it something completely different that just looks like it's a failure of the technology? How do you figure that out? What are you going to do when that happens? There's a problem, someone's calling in and say, hey, my tree is not right. You have to be able to sort that all out and have a process in place. The last one, though, is, of course, after all these technical and scientific issues and regulatory issues, is really the big gorilla in the room is, what will consumers think? And the point I like to make when thinking about consumers, and it's kind of like my view of politics, despite what the science and everything else says, in consumer world, perceptions are reality. It doesn't matter what the science says, it's what people believe and think and feel. That's what the reality is of marketing. And I've done some thinking and research on this, and I think one issue to really note is that the deployment process matters. You want to keep building awareness of the HLB problem and efforts to find solutions. I'll be honest, in the upper Midwest, most people do not even know about HLB. They don't realize how much citrus is under failing in Florida at this point. The perceptions of the biotech citrus will partly depend upon who owns and makes money from it. The big case study, of course, is the ring spot virus resistant papaya versus Roundup Ready soybeans. The papaya was one of the early ones, had very quick regulatory process, saved the industry, not much consumer issues with it. Roundup Ready soybeans, huge opposition to it. I think partly due to just anti-corporate feelings, but you saw the Monsanto's CEO, the little statement, they didn't roll it out in a good way. But part of it, I think, is just who was rolling it out. Innate potato is another example. JR Simplot it's not a small company. What do people think of that? I don't know. That's going to be an issue. And there's some work being done on Innate by Wally Huffman and others at Iowa State University on doing consumer experiments. And they're able to show that the consumer benefits dominated biotech fears with the Innate potato. They actually, in an auction experiment, showed that once people understood that the Innate potato had lower acrylamide, and they understood the risks that higher acrylamides implied, and the risks that consuming a biotech or GM, genetically modified product, they were willing to pay, that outweighed the fears of the GM were smaller, and the benefits of the low acrylamide outweighed the fear of the biotech. You Google GM citrus out there, and there's some generally I would call positive stuff. You see the 2013 articles in New York Times, Mother Jones, the 2014 article in National Geographic, Huffington Post, which is it's the opposite of Fox News, if you will, in 2015. The question you might want to ask yourself, and I think the answer is yes, is will saving citrus dominate GM fears in citrus? I think a lot of consumers would be willing to do that. I think it was in the New York Times article, Michael Pollan seemed to think that was a worthy use of biotechnology. But I think key in this is informing the industry of your commercial intentions and your timelines. And the one thing I've come through my own experience in Wisconsin, we have something called the Healthy Grown Potato, and it's primarily developed and funded by growers. I call it maybe a sustainable potato, an IPM potato originally, but it's broadened into what I think we'd call sustainability. Marketing is so expensive, and I think citrus industry, there are a large commercial interests in there. Work with them. Let them develop and recommend marketing strategies and deployment strategies. It's actually quite expensive, and let them help. These are pictures here you can see already with the GMO labeling. This is right out of my refrigerator, Minute Maid orange juice, non-GMO sticker on here, or symbols. It's the same thing in the Florida Natural, in the grocery store. They need to be aware of what you're doing and start thinking about plans, and let them help you. That'd be my recommendation. Next one is a dose of reality here. These biotech solutions are going to take time to be developed, registered, and commercially used. Years. Traditional insect management, pathogen management, cups or other cultural solutions, the heat treatment, they're going to be needed, likely for years. They actually will they even be potentially part of resistance management for these traits? I don't know. They potentially, biotech won't work or won't work for long. They may be the only solutions we have are these more traditional processes. And in my own experience, we never really solve pest problems. We just learn to manage them. Species are under tremendous pressure to evolve resistance to any management process. Insecticides, cultural control methods, RNAi, gene drives, the species potentially can develop resistance to any one of these. And then even if you do eradicate a pest, another one will often take its place. Sustainable pest management means using multiple methods, and biotech is not a silver bullet. It's just one tool. So in summary, I want to kind of cover my main points and be done. HLB for the citrus industry is definitely a black swan event. Large losses and big changes, but also opportunities. We're going to see a new world appear in citrus. Careers are going to be made, new leaders are going to emerge, new institutions are going to be developed. Citrus will change. The future is still uncertain though. Collapse could still occur. We need good science, good innovation, and motivation matters. We need to keep ourselves on task. HLB is bad. How bad? A preliminary estimate of $466 million a year lost in Florida alone. It justifies a lot of spending for research on solutions and on prevention and containment. As losses continue, we're going to start losing infrastructure in the industry and the capital necessary to adopt or to make these solutions happen, plus the markets. We're going to erode the citrus in the consumer world. Now is not the time for complacency. Biotech solutions for HLB. Transgenic citrus is in process. Spinach defensins, there's other ones I'm sure. There's a lot more options possible and needed. Transgenics, cisgenics, RNAi, gene editing, gene drives. But commercialization takes years after the Eureka event. Communicate with your stakeholders early and often. Let them know what's coming. I really think consumer preferences on genetically engineered crops seem to be changing. They're not necessarily going to embrace GM, but I think it's worth the time and money to pay savvy marketing and watch closely what happens with potatoes and apples. I also want to emphasize that technology stewardship is important. The insect vector and the pathogen will develop resistance. It's happened all the time. I've seen it with our biotech crops up north. Have a stewardship plan and a process to deal with field failures, to identify what is causing the failure and a plan how to deal with it. These traditional insect pathogen management practices are going to be needed for some time. Insecticides, biocontrol, different cultural control, good agronomics. Is it to help us survive until a biotech or some other better alternative emerges, or it may be the only option we'll ever have? It may even be part of resistance management, another tactic to reduce the few that do survive the biotech solution. It could all be part of the process. We shouldn't stop that research. And to be frank, some consumers are going to reject biotech citrus, so there will be a niche market for non-GMO citrus, I believe. And that's where these cultural or some of these other methods will be needed. The last point I'd like to make is innovation does not happen in labs and field plots only. There's social science is a science. We need to develop new institutions, coordination mechanisms, extension organizations, private sector roles are tremendous in this. And also business has a role. Just because we come up with a good idea, you still need to acquire the capital, coordinate the efforts to get everyone working on it, create a cash flow to pay for it, and generate a return on investment. That doesn't happen easily. That's research. That's innovation by businesses. So thank you, and this concludes my presentation. Please feel free to contact me if you have any more information you would like. Thank you.